I want to welcome Agile XRM to the podcast. I've known the people at Agile XRM for the past 12 years. I've seen how their business process management tool can add massive value to complex organizational processes in sectors such as finance and government. If you have complex processes or a need for dialogues on the Power Platform or Dynamics 365, take a look at how this BPM tool can add value. You can find them at agilexrm.com or check out the show notes for more details. Welcome to the Power 365 show, where I interview staff at Microsoft across the Power Platform and Dynamics 365 technology stack. I hope you'll find this podcast educational and inspire you to do more with this great technology. Now, let's get on with the show. In this episode, we'll be focusing on building scalable apps with PowerFX. Today's guest is from Seattle in the US, not originally he's from Brazil. He works at Microsoft as a senior program manager. He loves software and game development, technology in general, and music. He's also a fan of the Oxford comma. I am as well. I love it. He has a long history in developing productivity, developer tools, and ALM in the Microsoft ecosystem. You can find links to his bio and social media, etc., in the show notes for this episode, as well as anything that we discussed. If there's a hyperlink for it, we'll make sure we include it there. Welcome to the show, Joris.
I'm glad to be on. What you said, Brazil, is that just a way to tease me out or what?
No, it wasn't. Did you say Brazil? Or
no, I said Belgium.
Belgium. Why did I think Brazil? In my mind, even when you said it to me, I'm like, Brazil. And that explains to me why I thought that your name was French. Because, France, Belgium, it's
Dutch or Flemish, yeah.
How often has that border moved over the centuries between the geographies?
Especially Belgium, I think we've ruled by every person in the history books, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know why I said Brazil.
Starts with a B.
Tell us a bit about you from a non-technical perspective. Food, family, fun, what took you to the US. Tell us a bit about your life.
Oh, maybe somewhat sadly, but a lot of it is related to work anyways. But yeah, I've contracted the tech bug when I was in like middle school, high school, and sort of everything flew from there. So I went to college, and actually coming out of that, I sort of landed a job in Dynamics. I had no idea, I'd never heard of ERP, but it was a tech job, so I was happy to take it. And so here we are. And fun fact out of that is I was always very interested in gaming, but gaming technology. So, in college, I took graphics courses and stuff like that. And I still do. I make video games as a hobby type of thing. But back then, in college, I always thought that's what I was going to do. But in Belgium, there was just nothing. The internet was there, but it was just in its infancy and nothing. So I always thought, well, the only way to get into that would be move to the US, which seemed like this impossible thing to do. So I just took a job. But that job ultimately got me to the US anyway. So I was in consulting in Dynamics and then got here, was an MVP for several years actually in the Dynamics space, and then landed a job at Microsoft. So yeah, here we are.
You're one of the ever increasing numbers of MVP that go blue badge, over time.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I joined Microsoft in 2015, and I joined in June, so I just missed the renewal for. I was annoyed because Murray, I'm calling him out here, Murray 5. He joined like the first week of July, and he got renewed. I was like so annoyed. I was like, man, he got an extra year out of it. He cheated. But yeah, so I only have 3 years on my MVP. Yeah,
gotcha. That MVP back in the day, was your focus more on the finance, Biz Central, CE? Where was your playing field?
Yeah, it was finance. It was Dynamics AX at the time. So yeah, it was all there. Yeah.
Okay.
And then when I joined Microsoft as well, I joined in a solution architecture team, which is now sort of morphed into Fast Track and some other groups. And that was when FNO was in private beta, is when I joined. So I worked with customers and then came back to the product team. So that's how I sort of got into product development, then moved from there into the dev tools, so X++ and all that kind of stuff. I was an engineer on that team. Then ultimately became the program manager of the team. And then a few years back, I moved to PowerApps. So
nice. What do you do when you're not Microsofting?
So beyond making the video games, as I mentioned, I'm not necessarily a very sporty person, but I'm going to sound like one. But we love skiing, so I always go out skiing. I used to live in Colorado before I came to work for Microsoft. So we still do that around here in the Seattle area and up in Canada. And in the summer, my wife is a big sailor, so I'm just a tourist on her boat. She does all the hard work, and I love to take out my paddleboard. But yeah, it sounds more adventurous than it really is. But yeah.
Nice. I mean, you've got such a wonderful environment to do the outdoors there in Seattle.
Everything. Yeah, I always loved Colorado, and I was a little apprehensive moving to Seattle. I thought, we have these great mountains here and all that. But honestly, like Seattle has more to offer. It's all sort of smaller scale. It's obviously not the Rocky Mountains, but you got a little bit of everything. You can go hiking, skiing, you can go on the water, which is either the big lake here. You can go on the. I mean, it's a little bit of everything, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. Very nice, very nice. You mentioned the development of gaming, and there has been some critique of gaming over its course around psychologists being involved to make it addictive. And I think it's just a wonderful idea that no one's applied to business applications. Why hasn't anybody sat down and said, forget usability, why don't we aim for addiction? Could we make our ERP system addictive? Like, that employees would just love to use it every day. Could we make Dynamics CE addictive? That any one of those apps, PowerApps, could we add that, addictive layer into it? Because then there wouldn't be so much, resistance so much from a change management perspective, right? If people really, really, really fell in love with the software that they used every day at work.
I mean, there's two things.
What are you doing about that?
Yeah, I feel like a couple of years ago there was this, or at least a lot of papers, or I wouldn't say a push, but a lot of papers around gamification of software, right? I think that's sort of what you're referring to. I feel like nothing really came much of that, at least not in the app space. But comparing it to the gaming industry and the addictive, that's kind of different. Like and you've been there, right? I've done plenty of implementations before I joined Microsoft, and I felt, especially on the ERP space, you usually came in there to replace something else that people had been using for forever potentially, and so people are naturally resistant to change, right? So I always felt like in most cases as a consultant, implementing. Part of your job is implementing, but part of your job is just convincing people that it's really not not worse than their last system, right? So I think it's kind of hard. People usually users already go in a lot of times with this negative, like, oh, I have this mandatory training, or oh, they're going to change this thing I've been doing. So it's kind of, I don't think you can go straight in there with making it addictive. I think there's already too much work that you need to do to just convince them to try it at least. It's like feeding your kids a little bit, when you're like, you know what, you just take one spoon now, and in a few years when you're an adult, you'll start liking this.
Yeah, my thought wasn't in the area of gamification, although if you look at Duolingo, as in, the language app, they do gamification well, right? I think they really build that in and have used as something that is practically skill development, but has that kind of gamification. But I'm thinking more, in the games I've got into in my history, all of a sudden it's getting bright around me because the sun's coming up, right? Because I've played all night long on a game, and I haven't thought about, well, it's just you're so into it that time vanishes. And I just think that hopefully we'll get to the point that AI is so amazing that we'll give it the command and say, please make Dynamics 365 supply chain addictive. And every employee will be, hard out on it.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously plenty of discussion about how ethically correct all those things are to begin with. So, but I think you're right. We're far away from having that discussion.
Yeah. I'm not even worried so much about the ethics because I think it's an unattainable goal.
Probably.
I can understand the ethics of it in a gaming perspective when you're getting a kid addicted to it, and they're losing skill development time in their life. But for business, I just think, like you say, take your medicine, and when you grow up, you'll thank us for it, and see the importance of it.
Yeah. I feel like I'm going to get quoted on this, but you know what? I stand by what I said.
I like it. So talking about PowerFX, what part do you play in the PowerFX system at Microsoft?
Great question. So technically, I am focused on PowerFX within PowerApps. So essentially, it means the programming model of PowerApps. Now, with PowerFX still being sort of extracted out of PowerApps, that's only been going for 2 years or so. That there's a team of engineers that is highly focused just on that, but the crossover is I mean, there's no clear line of where one ends and the other starts, right? Especially, things get taken out of Power Apps, get generalized, and then we sort of have to push that back in. But also, if we make any changes on the language specifically, I mean, everybody has a seat at the table, right? Because one change in the base of the core of PowerFX means it impacts Power Apps, and now it's going to start impact PVA and cards and all those other products as well. And since that team is at this point mostly comprised of engineers and an architect, they have a lean on us as well. So yeah, that's not really a very clear answer, but technically I'm focused on Power Apps, but in reality, there's tons of crossover and a lot of discussions just on the core and the base, and even talking to some of the other teams that are new to PowerFX that are uptaking it to kind of say, okay, here's how we do it in Power Apps, or here's how we see people using it. Or so I think as that progresses and we see more products taking it, I'm assuming there'll have to be sort of more people on board and more clear lines of responsibility. But at this point, it's a huge collaboration all across.
For the listeners that don't know what PowerFX is and what it plays in the Power Platform ecosystem, can you just, in your words, explain what it is, where you would use it, what's the use cases, what's the thinking from Microsoft behind PowerFX?
Right. So we'll start sort of with the definition a little bit. So it's a functional language that's declarative in nature. So what that means is, a lot of people, even if you're not into programming, you may have heard of object-oriented programming, and there's other procedural programming. So this is a specific style of programming. The main reason that this was used as the concept for Power Apps and for low code specifically is because it's heavily modeled after Excel. In fact, we have a direct line with the Excel team where when we want to introduce something that we haven't seen in Excel, we'll reach out and say, hey, have you guys ever thought about this? Are you planning anything? And we're getting into that mode as well. They'll reach out to us and say, hey, we're going to do this. And so there's some collaboration. But so the main point is that we can have advanced Excel users sort of take their skills and get into building apps with the low code. And we're assuming the Excel team, I mean, obviously they've had tremendous success with their product. And we want to build on top of that, of course. Now, the declarative nature that I mentioned of the language is actually also, you can compare it to Excel, where you have different cells, and one cell adds up to other ones, and then there's a third that whatever. And if you change one of these cells, they all kind of automatically recalculate. And we have that same concept in PowerFX, and you see that very well in Power Apps, where one thing can depend on another, and if you change it here, everything sort of automatically flows through. We call that data flow. And that's important because that means, compared to traditional programming where, say, and you have that in Power Apps as well, but where you have a button, you click a button, and then you create a program that says, first do this, then do that, and then you're responsible to make sure things get updated and changed and set and whatnot. And you can do that. We have that's called imperative logic. We support that as well. But for the most part, we want to sort of take care of as much of that as possible. And you just say, hey, this is this, this is this. Here's how they relate or depend on each other. And the beauty of that is that we can make a lot of And this is, of course, what you want to talk about ultimately, is we can make a lot of improvements in performance as well, because the maker hasn't really decided on how things or when things get recalculated. They just said how things relate, which means that we can actually start optimizing and doing cool stuff without them even having to upgrade their app necessarily.
So that's interesting. You mentioned the collaboration with the Excel teams. Is it a like-for-like comparison where we are right now between what you get with PowerFX as opposed to Excel, or are we 10% of Excel, 100%, 20%?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I know the answer of that. I mean, there are some clear differences, things that they don't have to worry about or don't worry about, specifically typing, right? So PowerFX is strongly typed, which means if you have a value somewhere, it is specifically a number or a text or something else. Excel doesn't really worry about that. I mean, obviously, a cell, you can give it a format. You say, I want this formatted as a number. But in the back end, they don't really care too much. There's a lot of good reasons why you would or would not want to do that. There's just different scenarios. One of the things we have to worry about a lot is we don't just read data or present data. We can also push it back to databases, which means, if you push something to SQL, it cares very much about what a data type you're dealing with. And so we have to be a lot more careful. We can have different data sources, so we need to be able to pull from SQL and send the SharePoint, so there's all these things that there's all sorts of other reasons why you would want a strongly typed language, but that's to me is one of the major differences that I see. Now, as far as parity goes, I think it's hard to. I actually don't know. I mean, we have a lot of things that they don't have, again, because they don't worry about it. Like, they don't have imperative logic because there's no button that if you do a button click, you want to update a record, a patch. They don't have those stuff. So I'm sure there's stuff that they have that we don't have, but I don't really know off the top of my head.
So in the development you and your team are doing, do you focus on, is your lens on things primarily low code? As in, so you're creating experiences for, Fusion developers, and I'll play the question out, then you can pick it apart. And I'm particularly looking for when you've got pro coders wanting to work with the Power Platform or Power Apps, and I'm hearing from pro coders that they love PowerFX as part of their mix. This is people with over 20 years, .NET development experience, which I think is very positive. However, one of the gaps that is seen is IDE, right? Being able to update via Visual Studio or VS Code, and the full richness of what you get in that type of application, being able to step outside of the app creation experience with PowerFX. How much are you thinking of that full landscape of coders that are going to work on the platform? From, yes, the low code that don't have the sophistication, maybe didn't even know what an IDE is, but then also accommodating those that are absolutely, they're using this interface to plugins, scripts, all sorts of things, much more, and they want that rich tool set that they get from Visual Studio.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, having been a pro coder myself, I was an engineer at Microsoft before being a PM, and then being responsible for X++, having done that for so many years. Low code was new to me as well. What I had not expected when joining this team is exactly that set of problems where you have to cater to both, right? In general, when we introduce on the language side, we introduce features. Like we always joke, it's like WWED, like what would Excel do? Is always our first question. Like, do they have any experience? If they would have, like, what would it look like? We want to really make sure those experiences are aligned as much as we can. But you're correct. There's always this like, okay, but if a ProDev comes in here, like, how would they deal with it? So I think on the language side, sometimes I've struggled with that personally. With X++, so we have to make language changes. I mean, similar there. You go and look at like C# or something. So how do they do it, or do they even have it, or how would they do it if they did? here, this duality is a very interesting set of problems sometimes. Now, from an experience perspective, like from the UX in PowerApps specifically, you have similar problems. I think what you called out is exactly that. So the formula bar today is already based on Monaco, which is Visual Studio Code, essentially the web version. And we're doing more with that. So we have a team that's actually not under my responsibility. We have a separate team that's dedicated to those things, formula bar and whatnot. And so they're doing a lot of updates. You've seen probably recently there's been a new version of the experimental formula bar. That's something that we'll have to roll out. The thing with that as well, again, we're looking at cross-product usage of that. So that's part of this as well. By introducing this new universal formula bar, we can use that same formula bar in Dataverse and PDA, and whoever wants to use PowerFX, even if you're outside of Microsoft, you can. But we're already using Monaco, but this new version will get us up to speed on the latest tech, and we'll be able to introduce a lot of new features that are actually, as you point out, more geared towards ProDevs as well. By uptaking these latest ones, I think there has already been discussion about like full screen, or can we get like a pop out so you can code on another monitor? Those things and we're hoping to standardize as much as we can on that Monaco editor, because we'll get a lot of those things for free, right? You see that already today. Any language in Visual Studio Code, you'll get like collapsing code and all these kinds of things. All of a sudden, all that stuff is on the table, and it's more a question of, what kind of priority do we have? But at least we can do it. But I feel like you see, even with the copilots, you see the exact same questions, right? Like, there's different expectations, and we do a lot of user research around this as well. Like, what are the expectations from a ProDev if they have a copilot in PowerApps? What do they want to do? Versus you have a new maker or a citizen dev that's not very, well versed in PowerFX or whatnot. They may not even know how to get started. They're very different problem areas, right? So I think it's not just the language, it's just the product UX overall. And now this Copilot layer on top of that, I feel like adds another sort of dimension as well. But we have to cater to both.
Yeah, you know how in Excel, you open an Excel spreadsheet online and you get, let's say 90% of what you need to do. But then you can always go, no, actually open it in the Excel app, right? And then I've got all the rich functionality. And I mean, I particularly notice it between people trying to edit a PowerPoint, for example, and PowerPoint online, as opposed to the tool set is much more richer if you can open in the desktop app for PowerPoint. And I'm just wondering, an icon like that which says, hey, actually open it in VS Code and let me work with it there as a potential option in the future. That aside, one of the things that I want to talk about is building scalable apps with PowerFX. Right. And what's your thinking, what's your thinking around the scalable challenge, and how is that different from someone just building a single app that might be a bit of form capture, into a data that does very little, but more a complex enterprise scenario of app development? What's your thinking around that?
Yeah, I think you picked up on the key word there, which is enterprise. And I think Ryan Cunningham has been using that a lot in conferences lately as well, talking about this enterprise scale that we need to handle. I think overall, there's always been a discussion in PowerApps about the size of the apps and how that impacts performance and whatnot. But that's kind of a very vague statement, like size of the app. What does that mean? And I think in the past, we've done a lot of, or put guidance out there, and people have talked a lot about, okay, number of controls or number of screens or number of data sources. And obviously anything that increases that kind of size, just volume of things, will impact, right? But as we started getting into some very large customers, and we have some of my colleagues have been working with some enterprise customers that have these, amazingly large, and not just apps, but even like a specific button on select that has thousands and thousands or even tens of thousands of rows of PowerFX. That's just not something that, 5 years ago we saw much of, right? So that means we are moving up the stack. People are uptaking this, and it presents new challenges, right? And so some research that some of my colleagues did, I cannot claim any credit for this whatsoever. They've spent a lot of time on this, is that it's not just the number of controls per se. A lot of it also depends on how much code is underneath all of these controls. And it kind of goes back to a little bit our own fault. And I started earlier in our conversation, I talked about Excel and how, you have one column depend on the other. And then, so one of the things, the drawbacks of making that parallel is that people have gotten into a habit of just like copy pasting things, right? Like you do in Excel, you just select a bunch of rows, copy it, paste it somewhere else, and all the formulas and everything's there. That's great. But we're running into these issues where we do a lot of work specific also around that type system where things, whether it's a number or not, we analyze. Like you don't have to, in PowerFX, you have to declare a variable. You have to say, I'm going to create a variable called mark and it's going to be text, right? No, you just start typing and it works. But that means if you have copy pasted this thing all over the place, we got to make sure it's so always used in the same context, whether these things. So there's a lot of analysis going on specifically in the authoring side of things. And so this copy pasting combined with people building larger and larger apps is one of the things we're looking into. And it turns out that the amount of code that is across your whole application may heavily impact. And again, it depends, right? Some code may not be problematic at all, others are. So there's a lot of work going on there. One of the things you've seen recently is we have named formulas that have come out. We're currently working on user-defined functions as well. Those are all essentially means to sort of reuse thing. You declare it once and then you use it everywhere. Now we realize once these features are there, again, sort of the ProDev, citizen dev, or newbie, how did even, they've never heard of reuse. So ProDev may go in and say, why do I have to copy paste this everywhere, right? And then somebody coming from Excel says, copy paste, and those are things we'll have to handle. But at least we're working hard to get the features out. But then our next phase will have to be, okay, now that we have all these things, how do we guide users? Like if you copy a button that has 1,000 lines of PowerFX and you paste it somewhere else, maybe we should, hey, how about we make a function for you? We'll put it in there and then you can use it wherever you want, right? So that's sort of the things, the challenges that are ahead of us to start helping, because that's, like I said, there's some beauty here in that there's an abstraction, like we can do a lot for the user, but sometimes the way an app is built will obviously impact performance. And there's a lot on us. There's other work going on as well, just basically the back end of things and how we do some of this analysis. There's heavy work on, of course, improving those. There's always ways to, with new data to figure out, oh, we should have done it this way or that way. So those things are happening as well. But from my perspective, from PowerFX, the reuse, those features, getting those out, and then actually finding ways in the UX to guide people to use those. That's a huge focus because we've seen tremendous improvements in performance with some large customers.
How far up does that concept of reuse go? And let me give you a use case. I've got a customer that's a large bank. They've got a heap of apps that they are migrating to the Power Platform. When I say a heap of apps, they could have been Excel, they could have been Access databases, they could have been built in a point solution. But as we analyze those apps across, let's say, 4 departments, there's a range of apps, let's say 30 of them, that they're the same thing. They're all doing the same thing, except people did them at different times and they were built across, but when you look at it from an analysis point of view, they're the same thing. How far up does that reuse go? Because there's, when we go and roll out, and it's not that we're going to create this term now that's coming out, a super app, for that's meant to be the Swiss Army knife of everything. Because what I do love about the Power Platform is that you can have an app that does one thing, and therefore the usability, the training of people, though when someone picks it up, they don't need to refer to a manual, is brilliant. I like that. When I came from the CE world and we used to convert, Dynamics 365, what was sales, marketing, and customer service into something else, what we called XRM back there, you still had all the other baggage that came with it that people like, what's this SLA feature? We don't have it. Let's start playing with it. And it's like, you didn't even need it, as an example. When you look at reuse in this, are you talking about only within an app, or are you talking at an environment level? Therefore, we could have 50 apps running in that environment that could reuse components. What, as I say, how far up? Is it at a tenant level?
That's a great question. I think we have some ambitions. Let's start with the beginning, right? So today, I think the only reuse that we have within an app would be components, right? That's sort of the biggest. Canvas components is the biggest thing, and of course, PCF components as well. But purely from a sort of a PowerFX or PowerApps point of view, I think components that got taken into component libraries, right? It's a solution. You put your components in there, and then you can import those into other apps. Now, we're now talking about things like functions, right? User-defined functions. My expectation, and now that I'm throwing it out there, that's probably a foregone conclusion, but my expectation is once that feature goes into preview, people say, oh, this is great, but how do I now use that function in my other app, right? So we don't have a design for that, but something we need to come up with. Now, we have an even more interesting challenge this time around, because Canvas components is PowerApps Canvas, but a PowerFX function, why maybe I want to use that in PVA or in Dataverse or in cards, right? So now that concept of reuse, like, can we even apply that outside of PowerApps? So that's difficult. That's something that we will, like I said, I expect that question almost immediately. And for now, it'll just be, hey, just copy paste it, unfortunately. But something I want to do. And there's other efforts going on, of course, across the Power Platform. We have the Power Catalog work that's going on. So those are all avenues that we're exploring to see what we can do. Now, again, a ProDev coming in here, a lot of engineers have at least some background of like thinking ahead and modularizing code and things like that. As a maker, I may not have that foresight because I don't have the experience or the education or whatever. I mean, it's something you learn as you go. And usually it starts with maintainability, right? Because we're talking about reusing in general and performance, but there's also a maintainability problem where you start copy pasting and now you have to fix one. And now good luck finding all the places where you copied that to, right? So I think we can do a lot within an app to avoid duplication and help with reuse. Now, doing that across different apps, I think, is a whole other challenge because those things it's hard to do without planning ahead, right? And I think we're seeing a lot of sort of grassroots uptake of Power Apps as well. We have larger customers that have a dedicated team and, hey, we're going to build an HR app or whatever it may be. And that's great. And there's some planning and maybe even have a Figma. We have the Figma, the text. The same thing where a couple of guys are in a conference room and they want to just copy the whiteboard they just did and get that into a design. It's a very different approach. And as they go and they build. And that's I think, again, we sort of have to cater to all of these and we'll have to make priorities. So we'll have to figure out what we do first. But I think there's something, and I'll fully admit, I feel like that's something we're lacking today. If you've built a component, a Canvas component, there's no good way to get that into a library, right? And I think those are the things we'll have to start looking into. Like first, of course, we need the ability to share across apps and potentially across products. But then also, if I have built something like, as we call in software engineering, refactoring, we need some of that as well, where you'd be able to say, okay, I have this piece of code and I have that in multiple buttons. How can I just like collapse all that down and maybe put it in a library or just within? I think those are all very interesting. I see, as I'm talking, I keep my laundry list in my head gets longer, but I think those are all things we'll have to tackle. I think first things first will just be within the app, then trying to see how we can share. But I think that the next thing is, again, how can we guide people, right? Because that's the whole purpose here as well is, we're assuming that a large portion of our user base are not people that do this have not gone to college to build apps or do anything. So they might not even know this is possible or have never heard of the concepts. Like maybe they know what they want to do, but they don't even know what to put on Google or Bing, because they don't know the terminology. So being able to guide people, I think, is a huge thing in the PowerApp Studio everywhere.
We're well over time, but I want to close with this question. What are the top 3 requests that you're seeing coming through from the field? And that could be community, could be partners, etc. What are the top 3 that are kind of bubbling up that are on your radar around requests in the PowerFX space?
There's 2 I can immediately think of. I think what we're doing with user-defined functions, I think is huge. There's a lot of people that are trying to use components because that's sort of the only kind of the functions you can create and reuse. So I think a lot, even on the ideas website, if you go through, there's a lot of things that don't necessarily call for functions, although some do. But there's a lot of them that essentially are asking for user-defined functions. So I think that's a big one, and that's something we're working on, and hopefully in the next few months you'll hear something about that. I think that's one, and that's in the works. I think the other one, and that's probably not unique to PowerFX, but people are asking like, okay, we have so much stuff in experimental state. When can I use this? I feel like that's a top 3 question for sure. It's like, okay, this all sounds great, but I'm not allowed to use it until you support it, kind of thing, which makes sense. And we have a lot of these sort of PowerApps moves fast. Like coming out of Dynamics, it's kind of night and day. This PowerApps is very much sort of a top of the bleeding edge type of go fast thing. For sure, people are asking. There's a lot of things and components as well. It's been out for a while. We finally made some updates. I'm hoping that we can push that to preview and GA soon. So I think that's the other. And now third, trying to think. I think good. Other than that, yeah, I think the rest is just always very specific questions, right? That's usually what happens. And I see that MVP summits as well. People come in and they have this very specific problem that they cannot solve. But we try to fit in some of these side things left and right. We've done the copy to clipboard copy function. I don't think we've widely publicized that, but that was like an ask for ages on the idea. So we try to every now and then go through and it's like, is there some low hanging fruit that if we look at it now, we'll be like, why have we never done this? So we try to do some of those as we have some time in between other things for sure.
Nice. Joris, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Hey, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Business Application MVP Mark Smith, otherwise known as the NZ365 Guy. If there's a guest you'd like to see on the show from Microsoft, please message me on LinkedIn. If you want to be a supporter of the show, please check out buymeacoffee.com/NZ365 Guy. How will you create on the Power Platform today? Ciao.